the Good Doctors of Abbey Research. I'm Dr. Kristen.
And I'm Dr. Erin.
And you are exceptionally welcome to our corner of the internet for this chapter of the Colonizer's World Tour, in which we are talking about Spain. Now, you may be very confused. Spain was the colonizer. Why would we talk about them? First of all, we think it's important to understand the colonizers and kind of what happened. But second of all, we gotta talk about Franco, y'all. Wow. Dictatorships are like an internal colonialism in a way that I think we need to explore, which I didn't even feel that passionate about ahead of time. Honestly, we found this because there was a well-publicized movie that Netflix acquired that was a epic lesbian love story, and we wanted to talk about it for Queer, Elisa y Marcela. It turns out I didn't enjoy the movie, which we'll talk about tomorrow, but I did really enjoy learning about Spain. So,
oh my gosh, yeah,
awesome.
Fascinating place, absolutely fascinating. I mean, all the places that we spin the globe and land on are fascinating for different reasons. But I feel like it was really interesting because, you know, a lot of the places we've talked about have been like more obscure or that people don't really know about. And I feel like, you know, because I took Spanish in junior high and high school. I know you did. Like, it's compulsory a little in a lot of U.S. education systems. So you learn a little bit about Spain and Spanish culture and Spanish food. And it just feels like so much more accessible. And so to feel like I knew nothing about it when I was done, I was like, what did I think I knew about Spain? But speaking of, we do start these videos with what we knew about Spain before research. So a bit, I mean, we covered them as a colonizer, so I knew a little bit about their history of colonizing, in America, in the Americas. We went to Barcelona together. We learned a lot about Barcelona, apparently not a lot about Spain. But that was, a fun and memorable trip for many reasons, but we did really enjoy our time in Barcelona, especially visiting Sagrada Familia, which is one of the best places you and I have both been in our lives. So we have been to Spain. I know you've been some other times, but yeah, that was what I knew about Spain, and I didn't realize just how that was just a tiny little scratch on the surface. What about you?
Yeah, I knew like bits and bobs. So like I knew about Picasso's Guernica painting, which I knew
obviously I did as an art historian.
I knew it was connected to the Civil War, but I didn't know who the Civil War was between.
No.
And I remember there was a one-off joke in the movie You've Got Mail about one of the characters having an affair with Francisco Franco. And so we each kind of like pick a thing to focus on when we do these research stuff, and I really wanted to dive in on Franco. I wanted to understand why I didn't know anything about him. As somebody who has studied genocide for most of my professional career, that he's never come up, especially when the podcast I chose to listen to, Real Dictators by Paul McGann, opened with that Spain has the second highest number of mass graves in the world, second only to Cambodia. And like, Pol Pot's a really interesting person to keep company with.
Right.
When I associate Spain with like soccer, paella, and Brits going on holiday. So the cognitive dissonance was a lot.
Yeah, it was a lot. Yeah. And I think too, it was like, you know, as we've learned and as you'll share about Franco, as we've both learned in this, like, it's very much, we don't talk about Bruno energy.
Super much. Yeah. Including like a codified law that we don't talk about Bruno. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's like we could write a whole song on like we don't talk about Franco and like what that means and why. And you know, we're both fascinated with conflicts, and we've studied a lot of different ones around the world. Civil wars and dictatorships and oppressive regimes and all of this kind of stuff. And it was really it was the cognitive dissonance is a good way to talk about like the parallels I didn't think I would be drawing to places like Cambodia and Northern Ireland and Rwanda and South Africa and like all these places. And it's, you know, the reason, and, you know, Nazi Germany too, as well. There's a lot, and fascist Italy, as we spent time learning about last month. So, fascinating to me that like our global understanding of Spain is missing a huge chunk of the 20th century. Like yesterday when I told my mom how long Franco was in power, she was like, oh my God, that was a long time.
Yeah, and it is designed like, that way.
Yeah,
yeah.
And she was alive for most of his reign.
Yeah.
You know? Like, she was born in 1945. So, like, but she had no idea that it was that big of a chunk of time. So, yeah, let's do this.
So let's head to the map where we always start these things. The first thing, if you can't find Spain on a map, like, it's pretty large. So it's the like 2/3, 7/8, honestly, of the Iberian Peninsula. The bottom bit of it is Gibraltar, which is technically owned by the UK, which is a whole mess along with the Falklands, and we're not getting into it. But the biggest cities are Barcelona, which is a port city where a lot of cruises go out of now. And then also Madrid and Sevilla down in the south. The other thing to kind of know about the geography of Spain is that it has these mountains that no one can really get over called the Pyrenees. And there's been a lot of times in Spain's history where they were either screwed by the Pyrenees or protected by the Pyrenees. But that mountain range is a really big part of everything. There's about 47 million people there. Madrid is the capital. It is literally in the middle of the country, which I find amazing. And there's a plaque. I've never been to Madrid, but there's a plaque that literally all mile markers are drawn from in Spain from this plaque in Madrid.
Yeah.
Wild.
Nuts. I love it.
Languages you're going to think it's really straightforward. Chickens, let me tell you, everything about Spain you think is straightforward is not. So
it's not, in fact.
Officially, the language is Castilian Spanish. However, there are, I'm counting 1, 2, 3, 4, about 15 different languages that more than 5,000 people speak as their primary language. Spain is, I'm not even going to get into how it's geopolitically split. There is a great video from our friends Geography Now down in the downstairs about their semi-autonomous, autonomous regions. Please go watch it. It's very well executed, and the comments tell me it's accurate. So, let's head there. Ethnic and indigenous. I should tell you, Castilian Spanish is what most folks are formally taught in school, even though what most people speak in the United States is Mexican Spanish, which are different. There is no, like, the TH doesn't exist in Mexican Spanish, so it's Barcelona. Barcelona in Mexican Spanish. It's Barcelona in Castilian Spanish. So there's all these, like, little things, but it's not just pronunciation. It means different things. Anyway, I could rant about the Spanish language. Ethnic and indigenous, there's like 85% Spanish, but what the hell does that mean? They've been conquered so many times. They have conquered. They have offered amnesty. They have, Franco killed a good chunk of their population at one point. So what does it mean to be Spanish? No one is, to our knowledge, investigating it that thoroughly. And I'll be honest, with their other baggage, I don't blame them.
Yeah, but one of the things that I thought was really interesting in the Geography Now episode was that he had two Spanish folks there, one from Catalonia and one from Valencia. And the guy from Catalonia said, like, you know, I didn't really feel like super Spanish until I left Spain. And then, like, I meet other Spanish people and we're like, we're from Spain. And he's like, but then I go home and it's like, I'm from Catalonia. So I think there's really distinct regional identities.
The Basque region, intensely Catalan.
Yeah, but like wherever, you know, Galicia, Valencia, like wherever you're from in Spain, you're really proud to be there. But like when you leave, you're more Spanish, which I think happens a lot in diasporic communities. But I think that was kind of how that helped me understand. Like, they still think fundamentally they're still Spanish, but like when they're in Spain, they have really distinct regional cultures and identities and that are different, that differentiate them.
Yeah. I mean, it's honestly like the United States if we are honest about regional cultures in the U.S. So,
right.
Currency is the euro, which right now, as we film this in June of 22, is about equanimous with the dollar. The system of government is it's technically a kingdom, and it's a constitutional monarchy, but then there's all these autonomous cities. Again, please watch the video. I I am still kind of confused. So, but the best thing I can come up with it is that it's like federal and states' rights. As it seems to be kind of a little bit of a thing. So religion-wise, yeah, they're still really Catholic. And if you're not Catholic, the likelihood is you're not religious at all. So high amounts of agnosticism, high amounts of atheism, high amounts of kind of the non-believers that we call the unbelievers that we in sociology of religion, kind of like, I don't know what it is, but I'm not getting into it category of people, is probably about 30% of the country.
It's a lot.
It's a huge percentage. And I didn't fully understand why until I learned how in bed Franco was with the Catholic Church. And then it began to make a little bit more sense, because these are different numbers than we see in Ireland. And we refer to Ireland as post-Catholic Ireland. We don't refer to Spain as post-Catholic Spain, and I have questions. So let's talk about the economy. If you know Spain for anything besides vacation, my guess is that you know it for its major hit in the 2008 recession. It was one of the countries in Europe that bet a whole lot on the housing market, and when the United States' housing bubble collapsed, so did Spain's, along with Ireland and Greece. They were the three hardest hit. But the thing is, Spain has never had, I would say, a super healthy relationship with its GDP. So back in the day of colonialism, the Habsburg kings, the Bourbon kings, they all just kept spending the money they were getting from the New World. There was no such thing as a savings account. And they just kept thinking everything was going to come. So that was the first time that they went broke, was when they mismanaged the resources coming from all of their colonies. And then when the U.S. rocked up in 1898 and said, we'll take your last colonies, please, Spain didn't have any money to say, actually, no. So that was an issue. Then we get to Franco's years, and instead of, building the infrastructure of the country, he kept a lot of money for himself. And there was a lot of graft, because one of the ways that the country physically was rebuilt after the Civil War was through the use of slave labor and Republican prisoners being forced into slavery to rebuild the country. So there was a lot of graft, but it was a lot of one percenters happening, and no actually equal distribution of, not even equal distribution, any sort of distribution of resources or wealth. There were massive famines during Franco's tenure that we don't talk about. When people are hungry, they tend not to be able to, do things. So the economy is stagnant. And then when they wanted to, there was, during Franco's time, there was something they called the Spanish miracle, where things were really growing and everything was great. And I listened to a couple podcasts where people were like, that's more an accident than a Franco design. And it has to do with the fact that Spain was neutral in World War II. Not because Franco was a genius, but because Hitler didn't want him there. And so Hitler just kept sidelining him at the meetings. I have this vision of Hitler sitting down and Franco being like, Führer, Führer. And Hitler's like, I'm sorry, does anyone hear a voice? Does anyone hear anything? Because he just did not want Franco as part of it. So they benefited a little bit from that. They then benefited a little bit in the 90s and early aughts. Their tourism was out of this world. The king that came in after Franco really figured out how to capitalize on tourism. God love him. And really moved them to a democracy, the kind of functional constitutional democracy they are now. But they took all that money and invested in the housing market, which then in 2008 screwed them. So there hasn't been a really solid economic plan. Heretofore, here's fingers crossed that they'll get one kind of moving forward soon. But manufacturing is huge. We don't ever think about it. One of the largest car brands in Europe is called Seat, and they are a Spanish brand. They are a massive manufacturer, massive stuff. And now that they've repaid their debt, they can hopefully build a more solid foundation based not just on tourism. I will say, because I had so much to learn about Franco, I did not research the COVID of it all. So I'm not sure exactly how COVID affected their economy, because I was spending so much time on figuring out how they screwed it at least 3 times in the last 300 years. So that's my caveat there. And now I'll turn it over to Erin to talk about demographics.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where we've learned a lot from the colonizers that we've covered, that a lot of the lessons for good or ill that they took from being colonizers seem to perpetuate in their reiterations going forward. So yeah, they weren't good at managing all the money they stole from Central and South America, and they aren't good at managing money now, respectfully. So demographics, they're kind of a middle-aged country. Median age is 43, but they have a very high life expectancy, one of the highest in Europe at 82. The fertility rate is pretty low, but average for that part of the world, 1.27. And the contraceptive prevalence rate is 62. So all pretty like average on that front. They have a very high literacy rate and a high rate of school life expectancy, again, for non-marginalized folks. And I will get into that right now with human rights. So Spain has had some issues of late, as many countries on the Mediterranean have, of not being super welcoming to migrants and asylum seekers. So they have, a lot of people trying to reach Spain through the Mediterranean, through Morocco, through the Canary Islands. Migrant agricultural workers, similarly to Italy, experience really bad living conditions and exploitative labor. Poverty has increased a lot with COVID-19. I did find that out. And so reliance on food banks is rising, and people have a lot of problems finding Social Security support. So they didn't really plan for like the economic downturn that came with COVID lockdowns. They have some draconian freedom of speech laws and public security laws that really crack down on freedom of expression, which is counterintuitive to some of their more progressive elements. They were an early passer of same-sex marriage in 2005. So they've announced some legislative reforms to counter gender-based violence and allow for gender self-recognition of trans people. But they also in 2021 rejected the Congress of Deputies rejected a landmark legislative proposal that would have allowed legal gender recognition based on self-determination. So currently transgender people can only have the gender with they identify legally recognized if they provide evidence of a gender dysphoria diagnosis.
Okay, not the worst, but not the best.
Not the worst, but not the best. They must also undergo 2 years of medical treatment to adjust their physical characteristics to those corresponding gender markers that they seek.
Not great.
Not great. Fairly restrictive, can be very, very traumatic for trans folks to have to be forced to go through what the government deems is a necessary transition. So the only categories available on IDs are female and male, meaning non-binary people must carry documents designating them as a gender with which they do not relate or identify with. So that's not super great on human rights. They're working on that stuff. The ongoing struggles for political autonomy in Catalonia, we aren't going to get into, but there's a couple great videos in the downstairs. There's one from Vox. There's one from political scientist Professor James Kerr Lindsay that explains why the 2017, the most recent referendum, didn't work. So be sure and check those out in the downstairs. But Catalonia has had 2 unauthorized independence referendums in 2014 and 2017. And this kind of is largely reflective of the ongoing tensions between Spain's central authorities and its regional and linguistic minorities, which falls under our human rights umbrella here. The government has made efforts to protect minority languages, particularly the official languages in the autonomous regions, but many have demanded that the government goes further. There's still a lot of challenges to be addressed. And like one of the ones that I found really interesting was that a key issue of minority language usage in both official and health services. Court proceedings cannot take place in a language other than Spanish unless both parties make a request. Cool. And not all staff at health centers in autonomous regions are fluent in the region's language. So like this kind of, again, this like implementation gap that we talked about, right? Like they recognize them, like they're officially recognized minority languages, but there's this implementation gap in terms of language access. So Spain which I did not know, has the largest Roma population in Western Europe, numbering around 750,000 people. It's a lot of Romas, who despite some government measures for inclusion, remain like highly marginalized and discriminated group. They struggle with widespread social discrimination. This is true of Roma peoples like everywhere. And a 2016 survey conducted by Pew shows that almost half of respondents had unfavorable attitudes towards Roma. Which, when I talked about like high educational achievement numbers and school life expectancy for people with minority languages, marginalized languages, for the Roma people, those numbers go way down because they face these systemic and cultural discriminations and oppressions. So the history of the colonizer, to wrap up this video, at one point, the Spanish Empire was quite large. They had 35 colonies. There are currently 19 sovereign Spanish-speaking countries outside of Spain, and then Puerto Rico as well. Puerto Rico, they're not sovereign. They are a territory of the United States, but they also speak Spanish there. So there's a couple great videos in the downstairs that break it down. Basically, they arrived in Mexico in 1519 and Peru in 1532. And like there was a lot of disease happening at the time. So they really benefited from that. And there was a lot of regional infighting. So like the Aztecs were in power in Mexico, but a lot of like neighboring groups didn't like that. And the Inca were in power in Peru, and a lot of neighboring groups didn't like that. So it was real easy for the Spanish to be like, hey, we'll give you some money if you help us defeat these people. And they were like, cool, I don't like them. They're mean. I'll help you. And that was how colonization worked. And also the systems of government and like the function of religion were similar between the Spanish and the Aztec and the Inca, in that it wasn't as hard to amalgamate them. So they created an empire with two administrative divisions, the Viceroyalty of New Spain, founded in 1521, and the Viceroyalty of Peru, founded in 1542. And the real glory, like we know this, why they were colonizing in the first place was gold. They didn't find that much gold, but they did find an entire mountain full of silver. And so, Spain was an interesting colonizer because unlike the Portuguese, who bought a whole bunch of enslaved folks and took them to Brazil, the Spanish didn't purchase slaves because they used indigenous people. African enslaved people weren't trained to work at high altitude, so that was one. And two, working in the mines was like hella dangerous. And so they just forced the indigenous folks to do it, which wasn't nice. We do have stories even from the way back in this time that parents would intentionally maim their children so that they did not have to work in the mines. So super great working conditions. At one point, the Spanish mines between the 16th and 18th centuries produced over 150,000 tons of silver, which was over 80% of the world's supply. And what Kristen said in The Economy, like they became the richest country in the world real quick, because that's a shit ton of silver. But they didn't understand inflation, and they spent all their money on other wars in Europe. So wars are expensive. Guns and ships cost money, and they did. Then they tapped all the mines, and they were like, they really just believed. It started with Isabella and Ferdinand, and then they were just like, but there will be more silver. There is always more silver, and then they ran out of silver. So Spain started to decline because, in part, Philip II was super Catholic, and after the Reformation got into a lot of costly wars in Europe, trying to keep out Protestants and out Muslims. He was like, no to both of you. That costs a lot of silver. They lost to France with more wars. Spain sided with Napoleon. Napoleon didn't care for that so much. And then we start getting revolts happening all across Spanish America. So by 1823, Spain was like incapable of defending its American colonies against the United States' fantastically imperialist Monroe Doctrine. which basically, if you're unfamiliar, said that Latin America was in the U.S. sphere of interest, and encroachment by other colonial powers was not to be tolerated. Just very U.S. energy. Like, we're not going to tolerate your colonizers because we colonized this land. James Monroe, ladies and gentlemen. And then we had the Spanish-American War in 1898 against the United States, which was known in Spain as the disaster. And led...
and that's not hyperbolic. It was a disaster.
I loved learning that. The loss of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, and a number of Pacific islands to the United States. We learned this when we covered Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Guam, all those. In the early 20th century, Spain violently colonized Western Sahara, Spanish Morocco, and Equatorial Guinea. But they weren't good at planning invasions, and so the one in Morocco went real bad and they lost. But they managed to keep the couple towns. It's weird. Just watch the videos in the downstairs. There's actually a lot on, like, the oddly Spanish territories in Morocco, and there's been some recent migrant crises and, like, an escalation in tension between Morocco and Spain in the last year, literally. Again, Professor James Kerr-Lindsay has a really great explanation of it. I go to him for all my, like, geopolitical stuff. Because the monarchy kind of lost the plot with its colonizing in Northwest Africa, they were discredited, and General Miguel Primo de Rivera set up a military dictatorship from 1923 to 31. In 31, the Spanish Second Republic offered political autonomy to Basque, Catalonia, and Galicia, and gave voting rights to women. Woohoo! But regional autonomy was short-lived because the Republicans, as they were so called, had a bunch of people called nationalists who didn't care for them and who wanted to run things differently. And thus, my potted synopsis of the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939, which estimates around 500,000 people were killed. I mean, civil wars are always bad because it's the two sides. Our Civil War is the highest death toll as well. And the nationalists won. And that's when we get Franco and Franco, like, Franco'd all over Spain until he died. And then Spain became a democracy that doesn't talk about Franco. So that's kind of the impact of colonization and what happened after colonization, kind of why the empire failed. And it's basically poor money management.
Yeah, but it's important to understand, like, Franco's motivation to do everything he did was to make Spain great again. So right. He firmly believed that the empire could be revived. He and Primavera and another guy all thought they could be the Japan of Europe, where they rise again from the ashes and become an imperial power. And
you know, this is the same time as the fascist movement in Italy for similar reasons. The same time as the Nazi movement in Germany for same reasons. Like, this was all kind of the global or the European wave of this. We have to return to the glory of the olden days.
Yeah, and to be, like, from our perspective, it's a little bit like a European-wide temper tantrum. Like, yeah. That's, I mean, it's what fascism is in a certain way. And so what's interesting, though, about Franco is he takes that, and then he is one of the more evolutionary dictators we've seen. He became whoever, like, even more than Gaddafi, because Gaddafi evolved and then appeared kind of nuts. Franco evolved and constantly was in control. So The first 10 years of his dictatorship, how he fought the Civil War, and then the first 10 years are what historians refer to as the White Terror. And that's when we see probably the most death. It's when we see the concentration camps. It's when we see slavery. And then he was like, oh shit, here comes communism. If I go against communism, I can make the U.S. like me. And I need U.S. money. So that's when we get a state visit from President Eisenhower, and the United States and Great Britain and France and Italy and everybody else officially recognize Franco's regime as the leadership of Spain. Yeah. There isn't talk of a regime. There isn't talk of anything else. And then while he was in power, he did such a sweeping propaganda thing. They often talked about how most people in the country had no idea there were rebellion movements.
Yeah.
Because, like, you couldn't ever talk about it. He made this film that's, like, semi-autobiographical. He wrote it, and then other people made it for him, I should say. And that one of the podcasts I listened to said he kept editing it to show whatever version of himself he was trying to be at that time.
Yeah. It reminds me of the dictatorship in Brazil, right? That, like, recognized that you had to kind of put up the pretense of a functional government, and you could keep pulling people along for a little bit longer, you know?
Yeah, and so now you get the same kind of attitudes about Franco that you get with Mussolini, except a key difference is that when Mussolini fell, there was no Italian law that you really could not talk about the past. There was no, general amnesty. There was no anything like that. And there was in Spain. And why that's important is because it allows everybody to create their own truth in a way that doesn't allow for community cohesion. So we see people who are known batterers and known, like their hobby was torture, essentially, are now just enjoying their retirement. But the people they tortured are still living with that and might live next door to them. And there is nothing legally that the tortured person can do because the torturer has been offered permanent amnesty. This is a somewhat of an issue that we see as well in Northern Ireland. We see it in Bosnia and Herzegovina as well. We don't see it in Rwanda because Rwanda was like, let's go. Let's start justice right now.
You have 3 months.
You have 3 months and we're starting gacaca courts. Here we go.
Time's up. Let's go.
So it's a very valid thing. In 1979, I should say, when King Juan Carlos really kind of reformatted the entire country, the only way forward, because of this insane propaganda routine that no one actually knew what was happening in the country, the only way forward was to draw a line and say, okay, you can't bring up the past. And in 1979, that made sense. It no longer makes sense in 2022, where people are trying to now glorify Franco. And there's no communal understanding that he wasn't the most positive thing that ever happened to Spain. And Spain wasn't at its glory when he was in charge, because he didn't write about the famines. He didn't write about the deaths of everybody. Spain was great if you survived. Spain was great if you agreed with Franco. That's not greatness. So that's one of the reasons why I understand, especially for Spain, understanding how colonization gave us Franco and then how Franco now gives us modern Spain is a really important through line here. And then there's the other thing is that Franco, the only positive thing in Franco's life as a child was his mother, and his mother was a devout Catholic. And so he became a devout Catholic. And so a huge part of being a proper Spanish person in Franco's regime was being part of the Catholic Church. He murdered Protestants, he murdered Muslims, he murdered, there was a temple that he blew up at one point. To be Spanish was to be Catholic, and he enforced that with violence. Yeah.
And on that delightful note, shall we transfer to the Jeopardy fact of this time period? Since yours is Franco related, I believe you should go first, and then I will follow up with mine.
Yeah, mine's that's the second highest number of mass graves in the world. It's what I said up top. Nothing I researched shocked me more, I should say. A fun fact, though, is that the Canary Islands do not contain canaries. They are named after the dogs that are indigenous, because cane is Latin for dog. So that was fun. I'm glad I learned that.
Yeah, my Jeopardy fun fact is also the first thing that I learned about Spain in this journey, and then one more thing. So the first thing I learned that I found very surprising and goes into the whole conversation we had about the global narrative around Spain and Spanish history. They were neutral in both world wars. And again, I shared this with my mom, who has lived a longer life and a different life than mine at different time periods, and she was like, what? I was like, we never talk about Spain. We never talk about Spain in the wars. And there, there's a good couple of videos I found in the downstairs that explain World War I. Basically, they were broke, and no one wanted them. But then they were also like strategically neutral so that they could provide financial support and supplies for both sides. And it's actually how they kind of became not broke. They made a lot of money on the First World War. Second World War, Kristen already explained kind of similarly. They weren't really wanted, even though they aligned a lot with Mussolini and Hitler. Although Hitler at one point did want to go through Spain to get to North Africa. And Franco said, like, cool, lots of money. And Hitler was like, no, not that much money. And Franco was like, nope. And because of said aforementioned Pyrenees, it's not, Hitler was like, without help, I can't really.
I'm off to St. Petersburg. Deuces. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll go a different way. And he got real mad at him and tried to like give Catalonia to Vichy France, but that didn't work. Again, those conversations must have been hilarious. But my favorite fun fact is that there is an island in the Canary Island group called Gomera, and there is a language on Gomera called Silbo Gomero, which is a language entirely comprised of whistles.
I love humans.
I love humans. There's footage in the downstairs. Barb's talks about it on Geography Now, and you can find it in a couple other places or just ask Google. But I love humans and I love their diversity, and that was fascinating. So I will end with Silbo Gomero. Go watch videos of people in town squares whistling at each other. It's phenomenal.
You should also Google the island that changes jurisdiction every 6 months between Spain and France. I mean, just have fun, guys. There's so much here. So much here.
God, about that island in the middle of a river that every 6 months changes sovereignty. Wow.
I want to know how elections work. I want to know who delivers the mail. I have so many questions. But we'll pause our questions for now. We're never going to stop learning about Spain. If you are Spanish, a Spanish expert, and want to correct us or tell us or help us or whatever, comments are always open. We are delighted that you are here. If you enjoyed the video, we ask that you do the YouTubey things and like, subscribe, and comment. Share this with anybody that you are interested, that you believe would be interested. We love having conversations with each other and with y'all in the downstairs. Please, we ask you to join us tomorrow for since we're doing global queer stories for Pride Month. Tomorrow's is about the very first same-sex marriage that ever took place in Spain in 1901. It was legalized in 2005. So if you're wondering how that happened, join us tomorrow for Elisa y Marcela.
Bye.